Okay, we're ready to move into some more technical stuff. And the skills we're going to develop in this next section, which is on deductive logic, are really like nuts and bolts kind of stuff about how argumentation work, how like various pieces fit together to prove the conclusion of an argument. So you've now seen how arguments are structured with premises supporting conclusions. Now we're going to look at how you might provide complete support or at least good evidence for an argument. And before we do that, I want to get a little bit of basic argumentation theory into your brain. So we're going to do that in this lesson. This is pretty technical stuff, so I would prefer if everyone really carefully read the text lesson, but we'll give you a little brief overview here of the two major types of reasoning that you'll see on the LSAT. The first is deductive. And deductive arguments are ones where if the premises are true, it absolutely proves the truth of the conclusion. If those premises are true, that conclusion has to be true. In other words, the conclusion is something that you can properly infer from the premises. You could know that it's true without even that conclusion being said, as long as you knew, the rules of inference to get there. That's something we'll look at really closely. And then inductive logic is something where you merely provide evidence to support a conclusion. You're not trying to prove it. In fact, you can't even prove it. If you could, it would be a deductive argument. It'd be a different type of thing. So that's the broadest overview. We'll look at a couple examples so you can actually kind of see what a deductive versus an inductive argument looks like. Okay, we'll start off with an example of a deductive argument. And remember, a deductive argument is one where the truth of the conclusion is guaranteed as long as the premises are true. So if we take a look at this, here's premise 1, right? We'll label that P1. If an animal can produce milk, then it's a mammal. So take this to be true. Then here's premise 2. Take this to be true as well. The pygmy marmoset produces milk. If both these things are true together, well, you can determine that, okay, a pygmy marmoset is an animal that produces milk. So what is true of any animal that produces milk? It's a mammal. So you can conclude properly, it must be true that the pygmy marmoset is a mammal. So the truth of these premises work together to absolutely guarantee the proof of this conclusion. Even if this conclusion wasn't written and you know the rules of inference here to produce this, you could come up with this conclusion on your own. It's something that we can deduce from these premises. That's why we call this deductive argumentation. You're deducing the conclusion properly from the premises. So for now, the critical thing to remember is deductive arguments are something where you can prove the conclusion from the premises. Absolutely prove it. It has to be true. And now let's look at an inductive argument where we're merely trying to provide evidence for the conclusion, not prove it. In fact, with inductive arguments, it's impossible to prove it. Otherwise, like I said earlier, it would become a deductive argument. So with inductive arguments, we try to provide some evidence that a conclusion is true. So this is our conclusion down here. And with our two premises, you can have more, but here this argument just has two. We're trying to provide some evidence for accepting this conclusion, for why you should believe this conclusion. We don't prove it. We could get really, really, really impossibly close to proving it, but we don't even really try to absolutely prove arguments in inductive reasoning, right? So here we're just told most species of marmosets with long incisors feed on tree gum. Okay, great. If that's true, let's accept that as true. And then if this is true too, the pygmy marmoset has long incisors. Well, then we've got good reason to accept this conclusion that the pygmy marmoset is probably more likely than not to feed on tree gum. We're not absolutely sure, right? The pygmy marmoset might be an exception to this general principle. Even though they have incisors, maybe they just feed on fruit, leaves, and other stuff, right? But if both these things are true, we have some reason to accept this conclusion. All right, so that's a brief tour of the differences between deductive and inductive logic. Make sure you read the text lesson very carefully here. We're not going to deal with inductive reasoning for quite a while. We'll get back to that. The first thing we're going to look at is deductive reasoning and how to, make arguments where the conclusion is absolutely proved by the truth of the premises.